In this video, we're going to do a video as to whether or not you can assess if there's an allegation of vote splitting or not. Vote splitting is obviously where you have two candidates from similar political ideologies that split the vote and allow a third party to get in. And oftentimes on an electoral college map, it's very tough to tell. So we're going to be looking at where vote splitting is possible and whether or not I think it happened. In 2024, vote splitting was not possible. Only two states, Wisconsin and Michigan, went to a plurality, but those two states alone would not have been enough for Kamala to have won the election. Hang on. The tipping point state in this election wound up being Pennsylvania at 1.71 percentage points. But notice how Trump took Pennsylvania with an outright majority of 50.37% of the popular vote. Thus, there was no vote splitting going on. Even though Trump didn't actually receive 50% of the popular vote, he only received 49.8%. Even if all the third party candidates voted for Kamala, she would have won the popular vote, but she would have still lost the Electoral College. She would have flipped Wisconsin and Michigan to the Democratic column, but she still would have lost Pennsylvania. And looking at the other, close states, Georgia, North Carolina, Nevada, and Arizona, Trump won all of them with an outright majority. It would have been close. Pennsylvania would have only voted for Trump by 3/4 of a percentage point. Nonetheless, though, it still would have went to, Trump. 2020, in this election, was Wisconsin, Arizona, and Georgia were settled by pluralities. But Pennsylvania was an outright majority, so was Nevada, so was Michigan, and, so were the other states. So it would have been a tie until in the House of Representatives if all the third parties voted there. Nonetheless, I still don't think you could really blame vote splitting for it because it's tough to say who the Libertarians would have voted for. In that case, and even still, even if you can blame the Libertarians in some of these instances, in some cases even if they all voted for Trump, it still would have been settled by the House. I think you could probably make a case for that there was some vote splitting going on, but I don't know how strong of a case it's going to be. Because again, Jo Jorgensen, if you add up her votes to the Republicans' votes, those three states of Wisconsin, Arizona, and Georgia flip Republican. What I'm saying is, though, I'm not so sure if that's enough. But I will note that that Joe Biden won the popular vote by 51.3%. So even if it was a contingent election, in that case, he still won the popular vote with an outright majority. 2016 is a very controversial one because Hillary Clinton actually won the popular vote. As you can see here, she won the popular vote by 2%, but it was still a plurality. But notice how strong third parties are. They got about 6% of the vote in total. So it's absolutely vote splitting. Oregon came close to an 11-point state being settled by a plurality. It wasn't just the close states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. However, Johnson, likely they voted more votes from Republicans than Democrats, but with a Libertarian, it's hard to assess. Jill Stein, though, did take votes away from Democrats in these states, and likely these states get flipped over, if not for Stein. But then you have to wonder, could you have then blamed Gary Johnson on splitting the vote? And it's a very tough thing to analyze. And some states, that were settled by pretty large margins went to pluralities as well, like Colorado, New Mexico, Nevada, Maine was settled by a bit of a margin. That came down to a plurality. Florida, North Carolina. And most notably of all, I think, even Utah came down to a plurality. Now, Libertarians are often considered closer to the Republicans, so likely a vote splitting. Um, Green Party, is considered to be more Democrat. Actually, the Green Party is only to the left of the Democratic Party, so it's tough to say. Really, in 2016, I think it's certainly a strong case in 2020 and 2024 if there was vote splitting. But you could really make claims that there was vote splitting on both sides, because certainly the Democrats could have won if not for Jill Stein, but the Republicans could have won by even more. Maybe have won the popular vote if not for Gary Johnson. 2012, the closest state, Florida, didn't come down to a plurality. No state, every state was an absolute majority in 2012. So there really is no allegation of vote splitting that you can make. 2008, there was some pluralities. North Carolina came down to a plurality. Indiana came down to a plurality. Nebraska second, it was exactly 50%, so I don't know. But then you get to Ohio and Florida, they were outright majorities. And then you have to get to Virginia and Colorado just to find a state where it breaks even. Yeah, there was no vote splitting here. And looking at the popular vote in 2008, Obama won 52.9% of the popular vote. 2004, there's not really a case. New Mexico and Iowa came down to pluralities, but not Ohio, and not really the next closest states of Nevada or Colorado, and then Florida. 2000, you absolutely can make a case because this state tipped the election. Ralph Nader won by 1.63%, and then they say that the butterfly ballot in Palm Beach County tipped 2,000 voters to Pat Buchanan, which tipped the election to Bush. And obviously, with Florida being so close, obviously there were allegations of vote splitting. Doesn't help that there were a lot of other states that came down to pluralities as well, like New Hampshire came down to a plurality on the Republican side, and so did Ohio, Nevada. Whereas on the Democratic side, you had Iowa, Wisconsin, New Mexico, Oregon, and Maine 2nd District, Minnesota. So, yeah, you can certainly make a case that the Green Party really did tip the election from Gore to Bush. And it's not so much so because you have to make a stretch to compare. That's literally, just look at Florida and how close it was, how 0.01% decide the whole election. Now, 96 is an odd case. 96 is a very odd case. Because Bill Clinton only won 49.2% of the popular vote. As I mentioned this here. So what we have to do, so I want to see is, would Bill Clinton have won an outright majority in enough states to have won the election? Would he have won the election in outright majority? So I'm just going to have to go to my Chromebook and go to the computer, and then we can look. Now, of course, if the Republicans won a state, I'm not factoring that in. Like Alabama, for example, Bob Dole, Arizona, for example, came down to a plurality in 96. So did Florida. Florida came down to a plurality in 96, even though it was a pretty big margin. Kentucky came down to a plurality. Missouri was a plurality. Nevada and New Hampshire were both pluralities. New Mexico was a plurality. Oregon was a plurality. So was Pennsylvania. So was Tennessee. And finally Washington and Wisconsin. Adding up all those electoral votes is 128. 128 states came down to a plurality. Now, Dole won 159. Add those to 128, and he had 287, so that's enough to win. Subtract them from Clinton, he's at 251. That's not enough to win. So if you add all these Perot voters up, like that, you do eventually get to the point where he would have won. But number one, this is assuming that all Perot voters are going to be voting for Bob Dole, which you probably can't make that assumption for. And more importantly, like, it only takes at that point 18 electoral votes to really tip it. And looking more so at this, more so from this perspective, look at all these states that came down into the 49 percentage points. Take away Washington at 49.84%, and New Hampshire at 49.32% isn't enough. But then you take away Nevada on top of that, 49.18% is enough. So if all the third-party voters won, the tipping point state would have still been at 1.8%. And note that while Clinton didn't win a majority of the popular vote, he won more than Dole and Perot combined by 0.1%. So you're not just assuming Perot at that point. You're also assuming every other third party. And the far more common allegation of vote splitting was in 1982. Many say that Perot did split the vote in 1982, but the counter argument is that many say that Perot's support came from both Republicans and Democrats, saying that not all Perot voters would have won to Bush, and Clinton's appeal was broad. But that certainly allows to make the case for, because 92, Clinton only has 43%, Bush has 37.5%, Perot has 19% of the popular vote. So that's certainly a lot easier to make the case for a vote split, because Clinton's victory was weaker, and only one state went to an absolute majority in 92, and that was Arkansas. Note that in Maryland and New York, if you add up Bush and Perot, Clinton still comes out on top. Then you have to factor in the other third parties. Like I'll even show you what the popular vote margin is. No, I didn't want flip states. Like, look, this obviously could be indicative of a split vote. It's much tougher to make a case for. Much tougher to make a case for if there was a split vote or not. '88, you really can't make any allegations because it was just way too much of a bloodbath. I mean, like, yeah. 84, lol, no. 1980, you actually could try. You have to understand that John B. Anderson was an independent, but he he actually ran a Republican primary. But I think he took a lot of support away from Jimmy Carter, they said. But it's tough in this case. So it's very tough to say, and even then, Reagan won the popular vote, and it was not a majority. It's just that more so because the Electoral College bias favored Democrats that year. I think that they said that Reagan would have won 254 if it came down to that, and we don't trust that. Obviously, more common examples of vote splitting that people will point to 1968. Obviously, George Wallace took away support in these states, which likely would have voted Democrat if not for Wallace's influence. And then you also have how you could have argued how he split the vote in states like Tennessee and Florida and really all that stuff. And then just look at the popular vote too. Like a lot of these Humphrey voters likely would have, Walsall likely would have won for Humphrey. It was within a percentage point in the popular vote, and he got 14%. So very easy to make the case for that. Looking at some older elections, in 1948, it was actually more so that if anything, that these third parties would have supported Truman and not Dewey, so thus it likely would have actually been an even bigger blowout if you combine them. 1924, Coolidge had so much support that even if you combine Davis and La Follette, Coolidge still would have won the popular vote by 8% and a tipping point state by around 10%, I figured out. 1912, you could certainly make a case because of how much Roosevelt split the vote, as you could see. It's tough, but there's certainly been examples. But you have to be careful not to stretch them and know the context.